This past year in Turkey has been one of the most turbulent in recent memory. Terror attacks have killed more than 230 people, and a failed attempt to overthrow the government killed even more than that. Now Turkey faces a choice that could radically alter how the country is run. In less than 2 weeks, people will vote yes or no on whether to adopt a presidential system. Some polls suggest it's going to be very close. Opponents say the current system works just fine and that the changes will concentrate too much power in one man's hands. But supporters say that's not true. For them, a new constitution means a more efficient government and one that would be better able to protect the nation from attacks. Well, beyond the rhetoric, what lies behind the push for a new constitution? What is actually being proposed and why now? Our newsmaker today is Turkey's upcoming referendum, and I sat down with President Erdogan's chief advisor, Mehmet Uçum, to ask him why he thinks Turkey needs these changes. We'll hear from him in just a moment, but first, Natalie Perhonen has the lowdown on what the referendum entails.
On April 16, Turkish voters will be asked to answer this question. Do you want to change your system of government from a parliamentary model to a presidential one? Turkey's current constitution was brought in 1982, following a coup 2 years earlier. If voters choose change, there are 18 constitutional amendments that would be ushered in. They include abolishing the role of Prime Minister, so the President will serve as both head of state and head of the executive branch. And the President becomes the one to select 2 vice presidents and all ministers. The President will also have the authority to issue decrees in certain areas and will be able to retain ties to a political party which is not allowed under the current constitution. There will also be changes to the legislative branch and to the way the judiciary is appointed. The governing AK Party and nationalist MHP have both been campaigning in favour of the changes, arguing it will bring more political stability, end the potential for coups and strengthen the nation. 2 opposition parties, the CHP and HDP, have been campaigning against the constitutional changes. They're concerned it will concentrate too much power in the hands of the presidency and there won't be enough checks and balances. On voting day, Turks will be given a simple choice to make: yes or no. Their answer could dramatically alter the political landscape. Natalie Perhonen, The Newsmakers.
I'm joined now by Mehmet Uçum, who's the chief advisor to President Erdogan. It's a pleasure having you here on the program, sir. It's very rare for us to be able to speak to somebody who has the ear of the president, but also reflects the mind of the government right now in a very interesting time for the country. We have a referendum coming up. Many people are asking, why does Turkey need this referendum and this presidential system now?
Evet, şimdi bu halk oylamasına giden değişiklik.
It's very important why we need this referendum. The first reason is that there has been a search for constitutional change in Turkey for the last 30 years. Since 1987, the 82 constitution has been changed 18 times. But these changes could not satisfy what we need as a system. And during this time, we have faced serious challenges due to the conflict between the closed structure of the state and elected MPs. In other words, until July the 15th, there was conflict between the anti-democratic structures inside the state and the democratic centre that consists of those who have been elected. This is one of the most original points in Turkey's fight towards democratisation. And this conflict between the democratic centre and anti-democratic structures came to a head on July the 15th, because after the coups of 1961 and 1980 and the constitution of 1982, the state was positioned in a way that opened the gates to illegal and fascist movements, while moving away from people. This fascist FETÖ gang started to position itself in the state and in the last 45 to 50 years exploited its closed structure in the legal, military and administrative bureaucracies. By the time they were noticed, they had already moved a long way inside. They were first noticed in 2012. They then tried to take over the jurisdiction between December the 17th and 25th. And ultimately they tried their hand at a fascistic and reactionary attempt to overthrow and occupy the state. On the other hand, the search for a constitutional system is a historical problem in Turkey. It became the main issue following the 1961 constitution. And there was also a problem arising from the closed system of the state that was open to illegal groups such as FETÖ. More importantly, the reaction against the 15th of July is a revolution. This revolution is national, democratic and a popular revolution. It's the revolution of the 21st century. Turkey is not like how it was before July the 15th. Neither are its relations with other countries, both regionally or globally, that are plotting against Turkey. As in every revolution, this revolution also overthrew the anti-democratic structures. But it also needs a rebuilding process. Therefore, firstly, we already have a historic need to renew the state. Secondly, we need to renew the state because that's what the outcome of July the 15th tells us. And third, these conditions can be applied only if there are political changes in place. The positive response of Binali Yildirim to Bachelet's statement is only a judicial reflection of the maturity of these political changes. Now is the time for that change, as the beginning of a new revolution.
So what you're telling me is that it will make the country easier to govern, it will provide more stability, and it will bring the government closer to the people. And you've used the words democratic, pro-democracy, that this is democratic, and on the other side you have fascists and those who are anti-democratic. Why is it then that those who oppose the yes vote say it's the other way around? They say this is going to be a slippery slope to a dictatorship. It's going to be a slippery slope to one-man rule, one-man government. Those who oppose the yes vote are saying this is a moment where the country is going to be changed and it's going to go in an anti-democratic direction. Tell me why you believe they're wrong.
Yes, I think those who direct these criticisms at us are wrong, because this process of change is a very serious step towards the democratization of Turkey. This constitutional change will make relations between the people and the state stronger. At the same time, it's the start of a democratic reform. This constitutional change will abolish privileged powers and clear away those who engage in elitist politics. This constitutional change will take Turkey to a higher level by strengthening the democratic state, concentrating power in the elected parliament with an objective and independent jurisdiction against the challenges it faces. When you look at it from this angle, these criticisms are not against the judicial aspects of the change. These criticisms are ideological. We are in a period where political wars are being waged both internally and externally. And around the world, universal law and humanitarian values that supposedly apply to everyone are nowhere to be seen. The world has entered a non-routine period. It shows that the world is restructuring. The situation in the US, in the UK, in Russia and China, events that have happened in Europe, show that the world has entered a period of political power wars. It can't be said that the universal law is equally applied to everyone. As the world is becoming more polarized, Turkey is a candidate to take a central position. And because of that, ideological wars step in. The criticisms from inside Europe are also ideological. They come from certain quarters that will suffer political harm if Turkey is transformed to take the center stage. If this constitutional change is evaluated from within, it can be seen that it is much more progressive than other presidential systems in the world.
So you say this criticism is ideological, and you would agree that not everybody who's going to vote no ideologically opposes the government. Some people just don't want to change the system, right? Even President Erdogan went to a tent in Sarıyer and spoke to people. Clearly he's showing that he respects them and he respects their difference of opinion. And he spoke to them and maybe he tried to convince them. What happens if they win? What happens if on the 17th of April the no vote wins, whether it's by 50.1% or 51% or 52%. What happens then? Will President Erdogan continue to fight for this presidential system, or does he step back from wanting this system?
Şimdi Türkiye'de demokratik bir süreç yürüyor.
There is a democratic process in Turkey, and saying yes and no are equally legitimate. It is essential to the rights of citizens. Turkey is a democracy, and there will be people who will say yes and who will say no. If a yes vote comes out, Turkey's path will be made certain. If a no comes out, it can be interpreted as people wanting to draw a new direction to politics. If a no comes out, it can be interpreted as people wanting to draw a new direction to politics in the country through their legitimate will. A no would be a message from the people that they don't want to change through this model, but some other model. The current system that we use today can create problems on a constitutional level. Therefore, we are providing people with a presidential model that can solve these problems. If people say no to that, then politicians will be responsible to solve these problems, not with another model. A 50.01% vote either way would be a legitimate outcome. But of course, this numeric proximity of the votes would create political problems. Both results could be interpreted differently, but as far as legality goes, there would be no dispute. According to my view, there is a strong tendency in Turkey towards yes. Of course, those who say no might not favour any change at all, or they might not see this kind of change as the only way. But unfortunately, this referendum process is no longer an internal democratic issue. The world has come to a point where internal issues are no longer internal. The reason is when countries turn back to their inner issues, they are not leaving global effects aside. The world is at a point where the internal developments in countries that have potential for the future merge with global effects. If you look at it from this point of view, this referendum is not just about voices from within. For the yes vote, there is support from oppressed nations, Muslim countries as well as democratic societies. For the no vote, there is support from terror groups, those who are against Turkey and those who have different agendas in mind. Therefore, we see this referendum as restructuring Turkey, as well as Turkey's role in the region and in the world. In that context, we think that Turkey can help itself, the region and the world only by developing its democracy and humanitarian values. And this is the most important reason of this change.
As an outsider who now lives here and has lived here for more than a year, tell me how a yes vote would equip the state to better respond to PKK terror attacks, to Daesh terror attacks, because when I observe the campaigns, I hear that a yes vote will mean that there'll be more stability and there'll be less of these explosions and attacks. How do the two connect?
The political leaders who support that thesis look at the overall consequences of structural changes on a governmental level, and they are right. When you look at Turkey's current system, there are not only problems arising from the parliamentary system, but there are also problems arising from a model of political tutelage that comes from the country's establishment. An anomaly occurred in the system after the rights of electing the president passed to the people. It created a systemic problem where the president is elected along with a strong parliamentary party. But when you look at the structure of Turkey's government, there is not just the problem of two heads, but one of multiple heads. When you look at the practice of ministries, the executive structure has made them almost independent from each other. There is a lack of coordination and conformity in the government. There are serious differences in the time management of bureaucracy and the time management of politicians. There are large vacuums of bureaucracy, and it is very hard for democratic politics to work with effectiveness and productivity. Regarding the economic process, the government can't act quickly and effectively. There are serious bureaucratic problems on the level of businesses, even though they have been improved by the AK Party. We also have a variety of problems regarding the fight against terrorism that arise from a multi-headed intelligence where the central structure is weak. Therefore, the power will be concentrated in an executive department. This is a democratic concentration of power. The executive department will come under the control of the democratic political will. Coordination problems will be solved. There will be a structure that will provide conformity between senior managers and the democratic political will. We are not saying that terrorism will end or the economy will fly if a yes vote comes out. With a yes vote, constitutional change will allow structural changes in the government, and it will make the parliament, state and judiciary more effective in solving problems. In a way, this is to implement a mechanism which works for the needs of the 21st century instead of the old structure of the 20th century. That is what we are trying to say.
Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu in Washington said that the Western media is biased against Turkey, particularly pertaining to the referendum, but in general as well. That is a feeling reflected throughout the country here, in the media, among people. They feel that Turkey is given an unfair, it's unfairly maligned. It's held to different standards than other countries, and that might be true in many instances. But given that a lot of people in the English-speaking world are going to be watching this now, they might harbor no ill feeling to Turkey. They just want to understand what's going on. And they're looking at the timeline. And they're seeing Turkey right now where the president is angry at European countries, at the Dutch, at the Germans. The words Nazis and fascists have been thrown out as well. They're seeing talk of maybe a referendum on whether the people want to stop the EU process. They're seeing Turkey strengthen its ties with Russia and other countries in the East. There's a general feeling, and I guess it gets expressed also in the Western media, that Turkey is turning away from the West, sharply away from the West. And all of this, including the referendum, is a part of Turkey saying, we're done with you. Maybe it was those elitists you spoke of, the old elitists who always wanted to do whatever they could to please the West. But this government saying, no, we're not interested. We're moving to the East. We're being independent. We're looking after our own neighborhood. And we're looking for friends that value us and respect us on equal terms. Is that what's happening? Is Turkey moving away from the West?
Şimdi tabii tekrar altını çizerek söylüyorum. Türkiye'nin
There is now a difference in Turkey's journey between the 20th and 21st centuries. Western democracies, especially the democracies of continental Europe, are based on a welfare system. If you build your democratic standards, rights and freedoms on a welfare society, when there is a decline in the standards of the people, you'd make concessions to democracy. If you look at what happened in the Netherlands, Germany, the rise of xenophobia and fascist practices, those are signs that the welfare society is eroding. European democracy is on the verge of a serious crisis. The rights and freedoms in Europe are on the verge of a serious crisis. European societies can overcome this if they stick with democracy, rights and freedoms, and Turkey is always ready to cooperate in protecting European democracy. Turkey has no such strategy of changing its direction from east to west. But Turkey cooperates with anyone in democracy, rights and freedoms. If Europe is ready to cooperate, so is Turkey. If Europe wants to develop this cooperation, so will Turkey. But if Turkey sees a possibility of developing this with others, it will. The world's global system can't be run by systems from the 20th century. Erdogan said, the world is bigger than five. This is a highly reformist approach, considering that Turkey is a leader, not only in the Muslim world, but for all oppressed nations. Therefore, Turkey is not changing its direction from west to east. Turkey is trying to create a centre that has global reach. That is the main aim. Turkey will continue its relations with the West and with the East, as well as other parts of the world. Turkey does not look at this simply from a geographic vantage. When continuing these relations, Turkey will take into consideration that it's a carrier of humanitarian as well as democratic values. For a new global order, Turkey is simply asking for an international global law based on humanitarian and democratic values. Therefore, we should look at the whole issue from this viewpoint. Turkey never wants a closed, introverted structure. The reason for Turkey to discuss these kinds of options is only to increase the variety of options. Turkey will stand wherever it's standing now. Turkey will stand by supporting rights and freedoms, humanitarian values, democracy, and will look to make its own democracy stronger. Turkey will not only look to the West, it will look to the East and even further. It is not going to look only from a geographical standpoint. It is going to look to build a network of relations in a global system. For the 21st century, Turkey is willing and has potential to work for a more equal global order with other strong countries.
Bu işbirliğini hazırsa Avrupa ile yapar.
When I interviewed George Friedman, who wrote The Next 100 Years, and he forecast the future and so on, I told him, living here, there are problems. You have PKK attacks, you have Daesh attacks, there's internal divisions and so on. The economy, sometimes the lira is not doing well. It's very difficult to foresee his forecast where he says Turkey will become a huge global power again. And he said, no, this is absolutely exactly what happens just before Turkey is going to become a major power. It's going to have a lot of internal problems, and then it's going to re-emerge as a major power. And he mentioned it, not my words, he mentioned like the Ottoman Empire. And he said the only time the Muslim world was united for the longest period was under Turkish leadership. And his belief, as an American from Austin, Texas, was that Turkey is going to become a global leader again and be the leader of the Muslim world, but it's going to be a little bit messy first before it comes to that. Is that the view of President Erdogan?
Şimdi Türkiye'nin dünyada
Strengthening Turkey has nothing to do with the revival of the Ottoman Empire. Turkey approaches its own issues by taking lessons from the past, by transferring the values of the past to today, but only if they satisfy the current needs. Neither we nor Erdogan has a strategy to revive an empire, but Turkey has a strong social, political and geographic memory that comes from the past. It is quite possible to use Turkey's memory to contribute to a new global structure that's humanitarian and democratic. Yes, Turkey will be one of the most important countries, one of the strongest political actors of the 21st century. But while doing this, Turkey will never sacrifice democratic and humanitarian values. Turkey will fight for an equal global system, not only for Muslim countries, but for all oppressed nations. Turkey has no strategy for geographical expansion. Turkey wants political powers to stop using universal humanitarian and democratic values as an instrument. Turkey wants a real, acceptable and proper international law that will not become a toy for personal interests. Turkey wants the refugee problem, the hunger that creates humanitarian problems in places like Africa, and the oppression of the people for their beliefs to come to an end. Turkey offers solutions like people's right to settle. It asks for different approaches to tackle the refugee problem and the troubles of Africa. Turkey wants religious and ethnic wars to stop. Therefore, when you look at it from the angle of the 21st century, the values that Turkey are carrying are what the world needs. The whole of humanity should agree on this better future. Humanity can't tolerate these hegemonic imperial practices anymore. Turkey is therefore a country on the rise, with a strong democracy and values.
So then let me add a final question. Did July 15th change everything for this nation? Because you referenced it from the beginning of the interview to the end of the interview. If July 15th didn't happen, would we not be sitting here today? Would there not be a referendum coming up? If that coup wasn't foiled by the people, would everything be very different here?
Yes, we would. If July the 15th had not happened, maybe not with a revolution, but with a more evolutionary process, we were going to clear this anti-democratic structure and proceed towards a new constitutional system. We have already been looking into a new constitution for years. The consideration became strong especially after 2016. Turkey had been focusing on a new constitution before July the 15th. As you may recall, if July the 15th had not happened, the AK Party was going to come up with a new constitution proposal. Maybe at that time, with different types of cooperation, the constitutional change would still have been at the top of the agenda. July the 15th created differences in the way the process turned out, but did not change its direction. That is the difference of July the 15th.
Mr. Mehmet Uçum, Chief Advisor to President Erdogan, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I hope the referendum goes smoothly for all the Turkish people, and I hope that these are good times for the country. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I hope you'll come onto the program again in the future.
Okay,
thank you very much for joining us. And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.